You know, I don't come to the table here today being anti-vax or anti-mask. I come pro-choice. One should have that choice in order to continue in their employment, but certainly for government to come in and to mandate certain things, because all of this stems from executive orders, orders of executive branches. It's not empowered by act of the legislature. The legislature hasn't had a public hearing, as Chair Mike France mentions, you know, for about a year and a half now. The legislature has been sheepish and afraid to hear from the public with regard to these pandemic-related rules, executive orders. And we're here today not to prejudge, no preconceived notions, but to open the doors so that members of the public can come and explain their stories. After hearing their stories, you know, perhaps something could happen. We could employ that information in our future decisions. But, you know, next week we're going to be voting on whether or not to extend those executive powers once again. And we think that the government that is provided by our Constitution should be restored, and look forward to hearing from members of the public. With that, if you have any questions.
Outside of the governor's executive orders, there are private employers on their own that had put forward requirements for either testing, vaccinations with a testing opt-out. Is that something that you believe is totally between employers and employees, or is that an issue that you think the legislature should weigh in on as well?
Well, certainly the legislature weighs in on various aspects of the employer-employee relationships. We certainly, through government, through regulation, we say that in the workplace, certain materials should not be used for the protection of the workers. You know, here, sometimes those decisions are improper. But the gatekeeper function to all of this, you know, standing here 2 years ago, I would have thought that employers, private employers, would think of these things. It's the executive branch and saying some of this stuff is okay that opens up those private actions and challengeable. And as I mentioned before, you know, many of these people are represented by labor unions. Disputes, employee-employer, are supposed to go through a grievance process, but what I'm hearing is that these people are turning to their union leadership, their exclusive representative in that sphere, and the unions are not standing up for these individuals, and that's disconcerting.
Just to be clear, when it comes to choice, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the state of Connecticut should pass legislation basically telling employers they cannot mandate vaccinations with or without a testing opt-out?
I believe the state of Connecticut should employ the constitutionally provided process and then ultimately vote on these things. That process would entail a committee convening, public health, for instance, maybe labor, and hearing from the public as to proposed legislation, voting on it, getting it out of committee, sending it to the House and the Senate, having them vote on it, and then ultimately get the governor's signature. Certainly these vaccine mandates have been talked about for a couple of months now. We could have gotten legislation done. We could have done the constitutionally provided process in that 2 months, and we would be in a different place now. The result, I may, and my fellow members of the Conservative Caucus may not be happy with, but at least that's the process.
When you say pro-choice, and I think people understand that and people want their rights, but also in the same token, there's a risk to that to people who are not vaccinated, to those who are, and many employers and even employees feel they want their fellow employees to be vaccinated. So what do you say to that?
That comes back to the choice is cyclical, in that one who is vaccinated, and I'm not an expert in this field, right? One who is vaccinated, you would hope, is protected from getting what they have been vaccinated for. So their fear is either developed by governmental fiat or fact or something else, and that's why we're here to hear from the public as to what they would have.
Right, I think a lot of companies found that when they did do were people who were not getting vaccinated and not wearing masks. So I think that may have prompted a lot of companies to require that, and many are now. So are you saying that they're wrong to do that, and that needs to be looked at, or you don't want to see it on a state level?
I just want people to have the choice. If ultimately the employer's decision is to mandate that all of their employees are vaccinated, that's problematic. You know, you have the whole aspect of contract, where willing employer-employee get together, they've been working together, and now we have this major change in that contract. That's a whole other aspect of this. So I would have people have the choice, have that discussion, don't have the government behind the action of the employer. You know, from what I've seen, I've talked to some employers, they feel that what they're doing is supported by the government, and certainly not supported by the legislature.
I'm not clear on this. Are you saying that employers don't have the right to impose a vaccine mandate? Because my understanding of federal and state law is they do have the right to impose a vaccine mandate, provided they provide an opportunity for entertaining requests for religious and disability accommodations, correct?
I'm not aware of any state nor federal statute that says that post-employment contract, whether written or unwritten, that a employer can mandate that a unapproved substance can be injected into their employee's process body as a contention.
Pfizer's vaccine has been approved.
No.
Yeah,
No.
yeah, it's
Well,
not-
It's actually the German version of it's not been manufactured. The one that's here is still under emergency use, and they're still signing emergency use authorizations.
I know the press has been reporting something about the Pfizer vaccine, but it's not, the Pfizer had something to do with that vaccine. But certainly, even if we can argue about
Employers
that.
have a legal right, just to clarify, you don't think employers have the legal right to require employees to be vaccinated?
Well, you said there was a statute. What's the
I
statute?
said federal law, federal courts. I mean, if you look, the CHRO has put out guidance on this just recently. If you read through it, you can check that out. But anyhow, you don't think there's a legal right, right?
Under the auspices of what I described, for an employer, once an employee has been employed by the individual, they have an ongoing relationship, that there is law that mandates that an unapproved substance has to be injected into that individual's body in order to continue that employment is not.
Is that
At
the
will,
case?
this is an at-will state, right? At-will employment.
It is, but we also have wrongful termination statutes.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
then the courts can weigh in on it.
That's correct, and they have not.
Is the status of the vaccine what you're turning this on?
No,
Okay. Well, because you talk about.
we're here to hear from the public.
No, but you made a point about this being an emergency authorization, that it was not fully authorized. If it was fully authorized and everybody could agree that the vaccine was fully authorized, would your objections still stand? I assume they would. Okay.
Yeah, it's all about choice.
Yeah, the response to that question was in context of the question.
Okay.
It was argued that the Pfizer vaccine is approved. It is not in the United States. It's the German version by BioNTech that is approved and is not present in the United States. In fact, for the Pfizer vaccine as well as the other ones, you're signing an emergency use authorization form when you get it. That's still true today. But
Well, I have a question. You're talking a lot about employers. What about somebody who owns a restaurant that is going to require patrons to show proof of vaccination? Is that something you're critical of as well?
that is certainly up to them to choose. They can choose to do that. And then the people can decide whether to participate in taking food from that restaurant, in your example. Certainly they can do that.
So that's a separate category of employment.
You know, what we're here today to do is listen to the people that are being impacted by the mandate that has been levied and to hear their stories, which is part of our role as legislators and has not been done to date. So that's really what the focus of this. All these other questions are, you know, what ifs that deal in policy that really needs to be heard from the public as part of that process and has not been to date. It's been by order of the governor through whatever process that the governor has chosen to use and input he's chosen to get, but it has not been in the normal course of events of the public being heard by the legislature taking its appropriate constitutional role of discourse, voting, and then presenting to the governor the proposed legislation for him to sign.
So if the governor were also to require, in New York State, where they're allowing restaurants to require that it's also program with official proof. If the governor were to do that, what would you stand on that?
We're not here to express opinion on that. If the governor does that, we'll express opinion on what he does. We are here to hear from the public on the impacts that they're feeling from the impending deadline that the governor has set of September 27th, that if you want to stay employed in certain jobs, you must start the process of taking the shot. That's what we're here to do.
There is precedent on employers requiring vaccinations regarding flu. Now, generally, it's been in healthcare institutions. Is that wrong-headed as well, or unsupported by law?
Generally, in that case, and my wife is a nurse, you have the option. You take the flu vaccine or you wear a mask during flu seasons. You have an option. You're not being told you either take the flu vaccine or you're fired, which is what we are seeing today in some cases. Not in all cases. That this is the challenge, is that and I've heard examples of others where, for education and for other reasons, there are alternatives to many of those things. But what we are doing now, which has never been done before that I'm aware of in our country's history, is we are saying either you take this shot or you lose your ability to feed your family. It is that simple, with no choice, no option, and no alternative. That is what we're here to hear from the public, which has not been done, and that's really the focus of why we're here today. All these other issues are nice issues to have a conversation about, but we have not heard from the public, and that's really why we are here, to hear their story and what their impact is.
Support workplace vaccines, are you going to be hearing from them, or are you just going to be hearing exclusively from people who are opposed to it? I'm just trying to get the rules of
We will hear from anybody who shows up. There are no constraints on restrictions of anybody. It is for the public to come. Anybody who chooses to come here and have their say and their opinion and what they feel and the impact of either side.
So it wasn't just invited, it was anybody who was signed up and shows up?
Correct.
Is it your understanding that if folks do not take the shot, that opting out with a waiver, whether it be religious or medical, or submit to weekly testing, that this still would be fired?
If they're able to comply with that, but what we're finding in many cases is the religious exemption, for whatever reason, is not being accepted. Whether that's, don't know why, but there are indications that people who apply for religious exemption have not been able to get one. The medical exemption is almost not an option either, because the license of the doctor in some cases is put in jeopardy if they give a medical exemption. And the CDC guidance is very clear that essentially, unless you have a reaction to that particular shot, you won't get a medical exemption. And so it's very difficult to get that part. But back to religious exemption, we're seeing a number of them that are being denied. Don't know why, but they are, and then you're not giving any choice. And testing is not always an option. And then if you compound that with insurance is not going to cover testing, that cost is on the individual employee. And if you're talking about anywhere from $80 to $120 a week to test, I thought that $400 or $500 hit to their bottom line is not really a legitimate option. And the employer who's requiring it is not paying for it. So these are all factors that we hope to hear from the public on what they're seeing in their employment situation and what the options their employers are giving and what the impact is to them, so we have a better understanding of what the situation is in the state.
Can you just clarify how you reached out to people to sign up for this public hearing? Is it people in your district? It's people who contacted you? Can you be clear about that?
Yeah, we issued a press release last week, that initial notification of the event did not have a location. The location was issued on Monday, that it was in the building. There was an initial press. We also had it on social media. There were television interviews that were done. So the media had awareness that it was about a week ago that this public hearing was going to happen.
Do you have a sense of how many people
I don't. No, we do not know the exact number, no.
You mentioned that there were a lot of denials on the religious exemptions. Where are you hearing that from, and is that the state that's denying these exemptions?
Part of the problem is that when government opens up the door to this, I had somebody contact me yesterday who sent me the questionnaire that their employer gave them for the purposes of a religious exemption. And they wanted to know, do they attend, what denomination are they? Do they attend church? Is this an organized religion? What specifically is the objection? There was various questions. It was more than just a religious exemption. Merely to say, I'm opting out for religious means. The executive order also allows for a spiritual. It's religious or spiritual exemption. Spiritual is not a organized religion, but what I'm seeing is that employers are drilling down on that, and I think they're looking to cover their base, in case government comes in and said, this person isn't vaccinated, you gave him an exemption, was the exemption warranted, because we know how government acts in that aspect. Had somebody with, on a similar issue, having to do with the other exemption, the religious or the medical exemption. Wanted access to the individual's medical records going back 10 years to see, to see whether or not this had just cropped up at that time or it was something that was contrived. All of those things are very intrusive. And I've had various people contact me that have been denied their exemption as crafted by the executive branch, not by the legislature, which I'm sure we would have crafted totally differently. Just on that note for a moment, the requirement, well, I don't need to get there, on the second shot. No, one can't have a second shot without having the first shot, and it actually talks about having the first and second shot, which just doesn't make sense to me, but anyway. Anyone else?
Did you have any trouble lining up a room for this hearing?
No, actually. There was a lot of questions asked about, capacity and that kind of stuff, but normal stuff. I didn't run into anything.
Just getting back to the question, how then is an employer supposed to analyze a request for religious or a medical accommodation?
Are they allowed to? Does the executive order provide for that? It doesn't.
Or maybe existing law? Do you know if existing law?
It is not, no, it is not existing law. To my knowledge, it is not existing law.
To your knowledge.
To your knowledge, is it?
I'm asking you.
Okay.
I'm here to ask you
It's-
guys questions, and I'm here
no.
to listen to these people and you guys.
All of the talk that we've done about vaccines and exemptions, and I've looked at just about every, because we had the whole thing with children and, through the legislative session, I think I've read everything, every statute having to do with that, and certainly there is no statute that presently mandates a COVID vaccine in any statute. So therefore, any exemption, even the exemption for the children is not, that did exist, did not have criteria for one to evaluate whether or not that was appropriate. We had the whole argument over whether or not it had to be an organized religion or just a religious thought process. So you're familiar with that language.
Yeah, very much.
Yes, and certainly the executive orders don't permit that. In fact, I believe there's one executive order that expressly says that you're not supposed to look into the basis of the exemption. That could be face masks, but they overlap a lot of times.
Do you guys know how many people have signed up in advance for the hearing?
There was approximately 200. But the way excuse me?
200 and count.
Yes. The way we're going to handle today is we're going to have people sign in because various people said they were going to get here at various times, and it became a little unwieldy to actually come up with a list that way. So we figured the best way to deal with that is as people come, just sign up on the list. We will call them, and then we will announce the next two individuals who would be in line to testify and proceed accordingly.
So, do I take it correctly that you do not want this hearing to be about the efficacy of the vaccine? That you want it to be about the consequences of the requirement that people be vaccinated
Yeah, it's merely informational, Majority Leader Duff said something to the press about that we were having a meeting of misinformation. It's not our intent to give any information. And certainly if Majority Leader Duff wants to come down here and testify to us, have his 3 minutes, as any member of the public does, we're certainly willing, ready, and able to hear from him. But, that's the process. It's an informational public hearing to hear from the public and/or legislators as to mandates. That's it.
Do you anticipate on the 27th, a lot of people losing their jobs or not showing up to work?
I do. And it's very troubling. In an economy that's not very robust, during a pandemic, you're going to be firing nurses. It just is counterintuitive. So it feels, and I'm very thankful that I work in a small business and I'm not one of these individuals who has this heavy hand of government over their heads, but I'm concerned.
This is a question about the federal level, not the state level, but have you heard from employers who have more than 100 employees about, their thoughts on the president's announcement earlier this month about directing OSHA to implement a vaccine mandate, or have you heard kind of what they think about this or how they're going to handle this?
I have heard from more employees than employers of those large businesses that, they call their legislators, what do you got, a lot of people don't know about the process, right? So they think that their legislature can do something about this. People are frustrated and certainly not happy when, even the state government hasn't mandated these things. The federal government has to come in with its swooping hand to do something even harsher, is even more troubling to our constitutionally provided government and freedom ultimately. Thank you all for coming here today.